The summer heat of the high plains bore down on the tiny town of Dry Creek, where dust clung to boots and every dollar stretched thinner than barbed wire. Caleb Hartley, a poor rancher in his late 20s, leaned against the rail outside the general store, had tipped low, eyes filled with quiet desperation. His father's ranch had fallen into disrepair. The cattle numbers dwindled, and the bank's letters kept arriving, threats wrapped in official stamps. The truth was simple. Without land or livestock, he wasn't a rancher anymore. He was a man waiting to lose everything. That's when he first heard the rumor. Old Samuel Price, a wealthy rancher who'd recently passed, had left behind thousands of acres of fertile land, herds of fattened cattle, and barns stocked fuller than any in the county. But the inheritance hadn't gone to a nephew, a brother, or a ranch hand. It had gone to his only daughter, Eleanor. The problem was Eleanor Price was no one's dream bride. Folks whispered she was too large for a horse to carry, too clumsy for the dance floor, too plain to catch a suitor's eye. The crueler townsfolk laughed at her when she waddled down Main Street, her dress clinging uncomfortably, her cheeks flushed from the stares. She was the obese stranger no man wanted, at least not until the will was read aloud. The words were clear. The land and cattle would pass to Eleanor's husband. Until she wed, the estate remained locked.
Caleb had never spoken to Eleanor,
though he'd seen her once or twice at church, standing awkwardly at the back. He wasn't proud of the thought forming in his mind, but hunger and survival leave little room for pride. If marrying Eleanor meant securing the ranch, he'd do it. That night he rode home beneath the stars, the dry wind tugging at his shirt, the weight of his father's legacy pressing on his shoulders. The decision hardened inside him like steel. He would marry Eleanor. 2 weeks later, they stood inside the chapel. Caleb wore his best shirt, patched at the elbows, and Eleanor, in a cream gown, clutched a bouquet that trembled in her hands. Her eyes, blue and soft, darted everywhere but at him. The townsfolk filled the pews, whispering, gossiping, waiting to see if the poor rancher would really go through with it. When the preacher asked Caleb if he took Eleanor as his wife, he paused just long enough for everyone to hear it. His voice finally came strong but empty. "I do." Eleanor's lips quivered as she whispered the same words, her face flushing red. The kiss that followed was brief, almost reluctant, but the papers were signed. And just like that, Caleb Hartley had the ranch, the land, the cattle. At first, Caleb kept his distance. He worked the fields, mended fences, and rode out early, leaving Eleanor to the big empty house her father had built. She tried to make it a home, cooking meals, tidying rooms, leaving little notes for him on the kitchen table, but Caleb barely noticed. He saw her sighs before he saw her, kindness. Nights passed where they sat across from each other at the dinner table in silence, the only sound the ticking clock on the wall. To Caleb, she was a stranger in his home, someone he'd bargained with but never really chosen. But then small things began to change. One morning, when his horse bucked and nearly threw him into the dust, it was Eleanor who rushed out with surprising speed, grabbing the reins and calming the animal like she'd been born in the saddle. "Pa taught me," she said simply, brushing hay from her dress, her cheeks glowing. Another day when the ranch hands quit without warning, it was Eleanor who rolled up her sleeves, hauling feed sacks twice her size, sweat dripping down her brow as she laughed at Caleb's astonishment. "What? Did you think I just sat on porches and fanned myself all day?" She teased, her voice light but steady. Caleb began to see more than her size. He noticed the determination in her eyes, the way she didn't flinch under ridicule, the strength in her hands as she worked beside him. He began to hear her laughter, low and melodic, breaking the silence of the big house. And for the first time he began to feel guilt gnaw at his chest. He hadn't married Eleanor out of love. He'd married her for the land. But Eleanor, she gave him something he hadn't expected. She gave him companionship. The turning point came one stormy night. The wind howled like wolves, rattling shutters and tearing shingles. Caleb rushed out to the barn, afraid the livestock would panic, only to find Eleanor already there, soaked through, her dress plastered against her skin, hauling terrified calves into shelter. Her hair clung to her face, her hands were raw, but her eyes burned with fire. "I'm not leaving them to die," she shouted over the storm. Together they worked until dawn, saving every animal they could. When they collapsed on the barn floor, mud and rain streaking their faces, Caleb looked at her with new eyes. This woman, whom he had married for selfish reasons, was braver, stronger, and more loyal than he'd ever imagined. The days after the storm painted Eleanor in a new light for Caleb. She moved with confidence now, her laughter filling the once empty halls of the ranch house, her determination sparking admiration in the ranch hands who'd once mocked her. Caleb found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, her flushed cheeks as she kneaded bread in the kitchen, her strong arms as she carried water buckets, the way she hummed softly to herself when she thought she was alone. He realized she wasn't the stranger he'd believed her to be. She was the partner he had always needed. But whispers in town didn't stop. Some sneered at Caleb for marrying the obese woman for land, and others pitied Eleanor for being chosen only because no one else would. The gossip stung more than Caleb expected, and he saw how Eleanor lowered her gaze in town, shoulders tense as if bracing for the ridicule. One afternoon outside the general store, a group of men snickered loud enough for her to hear. Caleb's blood boiled. He stepped forward, fists clenched, and growled, "You don't talk about my wife that way." The men fell silent, not because of his words, but because of the conviction in his voice. For the first time, Caleb realized he wasn't protecting a bargain. He was protecting his heart. Life on the ranch grew easier with Eleanor at his side. She organized the ledgers, caught mistakes Caleb had overlooked, and managed the household with precision. But beyond her practicality, she carried a warmth that made the house glow. When Caleb returned from long days in the field, she was there, not with judgment or coldness, but with meals, stories, and that smile that somehow made him forget the dust on his boots. He found himself laughing again, something he hadn't done in years. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the horizon, Caleb finally spoke the truth he had buried deep. "Eleanor, I didn't marry you for the right reasons." Her hand stilled on her lap, her eyes glistening in the fading light. He swallowed hard, heart pounding. "I married you for the land, for the cattle, for survival, but now, none of that matters. Because somewhere along the way, I realized I can't imagine this ranch, this life, without you." Silence stretched between them until Eleanor finally turned, tears tracing down her cheeks, a smile trembling at her lips. "I always knew," she whispered, "but I prayed you'd see me for who I am, not what people say." Caleb reached for her hand, holding it tightly, vowing silently never to let it go. From that night forward, the ranch was no longer a burden but a home. Together they rebuilt fences, raised calves, and faced the challenges of ranch life as equals. Eleanor's strength shocked him time and again. Whether in the barnyard, at the market, or in her endless loyalty, she wasn't the stranger he had married for land. She was the woman who had taught him love, respect, and what it meant to truly belong. As seasons passed, townsfolk stopped sneering. They saw the couple working side by side, thriving, and whispers turned into admiration. Some even said Eleanor had transformed Caleb, but the truth was Caleb had been blind until Eleanor's light showed him the way. And so, what began as a desperate bargain became a love story etched into the soil of Dry Creek. A poor rancher had gained not just a ranch, but a wife who shocked him like he'd never been before. Not with her land, not with her wealth, but with her heart.